Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. Earlier this week, Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan extended a citywide eviction moratorium through the end of June, giving tenants a few more months of protection before facing the possibility of being kicked out of their homes in the middle of a pandemic. Now, Durkan's move was undoubtedly welcome news for Seattle residents who have fallen behind on rent due to all of this, the economic impacts of COVID-19, the pandemic, but the extension does nothing to address the inevitability of what people are beginning to call the eviction cliff. It simply delays the eviction cliff. It puts off the date on which thousands of Seattle residents will fall victim to an evictions machine that many of the city's landlords have been eager to make use of. So today we're going to be talking about one really important thing that can be done to give tenants in Seattle a fighting chance against an eviction process that has been unfairly stacked against them, both in Seattle and across the country. Under an ordinance introduced by Seattle City Councilwoman Kshama Sawant, anyone facing eviction would be guaranteed a right to legal counsel during these proceedings, regardless of their ability to pay. So put simply, this is a really big deal. Going through eviction without an attorney pretty much guarantees you're going to lose. Going through most legal proceedings without an attorney is a bad idea. But tenants without counsel, people fighting for their homes with no lawyer by their side, are much more likely to lose their homes and be forced to get out in evictions carried out by local sheriff's deputies. These people are less likely to be able to negotiate move-out dates, keep evictions off their records, find a rental or find relocation assistance, or even apply for public housing, which you would think would be the most basic service that should be given to people who are losing their housing, is an avenue to regain housing. But without a lawyer, odds are slim. And all of this damages the ability to help people stay housed or get housed in the future. So while granting tenants in Seattle this sort of right to counsel in eviction court may not prevent the evictions cliff, it's something we have to be talking about. It could provide tenants with a fighting chance, some level of protection, a path to a better outcome. And all of this is going to be essential when this moratorium inevitably expires and this wave of evictions proceedings begins. So here with me now to discuss the importance of a right to counsel in housing court and right to counsel legislation in Seattle is Councilwoman Kshama Sawant. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to start by asking you, tell us what you feel this will do. Why is this so important? You've fought to implement a right to counsel in Seattle Housing Court. What impact do you anticipate this new legislation having?
I think the bottom line is exactly what you said, Emily, is that the housing market and really indeed the whole system of capitalism itself is stacked up against ordinary working people. And that means the vast majority of renters who are overwhelmingly struggling paycheck to paycheck. And then on top of that, predating the pandemic, have been paying 30%, 40%, 50%, sometimes even 80%, believe it or not, of their paycheck on rent, because that's how much rents have skyrocketed. And as you correctly said, the right to have a lawyer next to you when you're facing eviction in court will not necessarily prevent the eviction, although I want to say something about it in a second. But what it will do is exactly what you said, Emily, is it will provide a fighting chance to the renter. Look at the statistics from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. What they report is that over 90% of landlords have their own attorneys. And who are the evicting landlords? The most evicting landlords are corporate landlords, mega landlords like Goodman Real Estate and other corporations that have real estate, not just in Seattle, for example, but in multiple cities, sometimes in America and Canada. And these are billions of dollars worth of real estate holdings. And so they have their highly paid attorneys. Imagine being a renter, which is typically, again, statistically speaking, overwhelmingly a Black mom or somebody who is really facing financial distress to the degree that they are simply not able to pay their rent. They are out of options. Imagine you go to court and you're faced with this labyrinthine process that you are not familiar with. And on top of that, you have a corporate landlord who is eager to evict you and has come equipped with this fancy lawyer. what do you do then? This is what this legislation, if passed by the city council, would change, is it would give a guaranteed right to all renters. If you face eviction, you will have an attorney, a lawyer by your side. And just one thing I'll mention also is that other cities that have this experience already, who have passed this right to counsel, they find actually that not only are evictions prevented when you have an attorney by your side, the number of eviction filings by corporate landlords go down, because now the corporate landlords know they don't just get to go and just exploit a vulnerable renter, but they're going to face a trained attorney.
Man, the fallout of that is so extreme. And what you've just described to me, I mean, I used to be a public defender, and I know how scary court is for ordinary people. But to imagine what it's like to go to court and have everybody else have lawyers, and to be by yourself and fighting for something as urgent as a roof over your head, maybe your kid's head, it's really, really striking. So given the stakes and given the effectiveness that you just outlined, which, by the way, I want to delve into more in a second, because those impacts you talked about, lower eviction rates and lower eviction filings, are really, really significant. But let's start at where the legislation stands. Can you give us a status update on the proposal? Where does it stand?
Yes, so as we proposed it, meaning when I say we, it's my Socialist Council office, alongside renters' rights advocates, organizations, labor unions, and our renters' rights movement. Indeed, the whole idea of the right to counsel legislation, actually, its genesis is from 7 years ago, when we first took office as the first socialist in City Hall for over 100 years. And we really pushed renters' rights alongside the $15 minimum wage and the Amazon tax that we have already won, which were our campaign promises when we first ran as a socialist. Having a full bill of tenants' rights was part of what we were campaigning for. And since then, we've built these renters' rights movements. And through those movements and through the people's budget actions that we have initiated in Seattle, we've been able to win funding for attorneys for renters facing eviction, but it is not a guaranteed right. It's a very limited amount of money. So what we're trying to do with this legislation is to transform that into a guarantee. If you need a lawyer, it will be paid for by the city. And what happened is this past Monday, just Monday this week, it was very, very unfortunate that the Democrats on the city council, they're all Democrats, it's 8 Democrats and it's me, 1 socialist. Unfortunately, while 2 of the Democrats voted along with me, the rest of them voted to delay the bill. And unfortunately, they're being very dishonest. They're saying that we need to make the bill stronger. And herein lies the crux of the whole discussion. It's actually dishonest of them to say that they want to make it stronger, because the whole problem here is a political one. It's not a technocratic one, which is that the bill as it stands, as we have put forward, is the strongest possible bill. It's the bill like in San Francisco and Baltimore and other cities, where there are no loopholes for corporate landlords to exploit. There is nothing called means testing, meaning regardless of what your income is, you will get a lawyer and you don't have to provide any paperwork, because we know from economic evidence, overwhelming economic evidence, that when vulnerable families who are actually eligible for the public assistance, if they're forced to show proof, they unfortunately lose out, because many of them may not have that paperwork. Unfortunately, what the council members, Democrats, want to do is put in means testing, meaning make it easier for corporate landlords to have vulnerable renters who are denied this service. And right now, the fight is to eliminate means testing. I mean, it may be that the Democrats want to go so far as to actually not even vote this bill in. But even if they do vote yes on the 29th, when the vote is coming back, they will try to put in means testing, and they're making legalistic arguments. But actually, we have attorneys on the side of the movement who are saying that actually means testing is a bad idea.
Well, then on like who supports this, right? Because when I think about it just sort of logically, if I'm a judge overseeing housing court, I don't want to be dealing with scared people who have no lawyer and don't know what's going on. It makes my courtroom harder to run. If I'm a person, I obviously want a lawyer by my side. If I'm a resident who's not at risk of eviction, I would like to see fewer people who are unhoused living on the street in my neighborhood. If I'm a teacher, I want more kids in my classroom to have a safe place to go home to. Like, I'm just trying to think about like who is beyond the landlords, who is against this? And if it is in fact just the landlords who are against this, are the Democrats that much in their pocket?
I think that's a very important question. First of all, who is against this bill and who wants to put in loopholes? It is unfortunately the corporate landlords. There is no Unfortunately, there is no bigger story or bigger mystery to this. It's the corporate landlords and it's big business as a whole who have a stake in either not allowing renters' rights happen in the first place, but if the balance of power, meaning public opinion, is so strongly on the side of renters' rights and they can't stop the law from happening, then they will try to put in loopholes. We've seen this over and over and over again, whether it is workers' rights or labor unions or renters' rights, or even women's rights and social questions. We will see that big business and Wall Street and big banks are always against it. So corporate landlords are most directly against it because they do very clearly take just unreal advantage of a housing market that is completely stacked up against renters. And that's where you can also explain why the rents are skyrocketing at the same time that you have historic levels of vacancy rates in many different cities like Seattle. So it's no surprise that they are against it and they want loopholes. But big business as a whole and the elite and the people who want to maintain the status quo don't want any progressive victories, because they know that any progressive victory, especially one that is won by community organizing, by working people joining together and fighting against big business and the politicians who stand against them, that sends a message of confidence. It's a feeling that if they could win, we can win too. Also, if we could win this, what else could we win? Which is why every time that we have fought for anything, whether it be $15 an hour minimum wage or taxing big business to fund affordable housing or the whole series of renters' rights that we have won, none of them has come without a fight, because the powers that be always fight us. Now, the question, I think your question was also very important, because it's also important to understand why are the Democrats against it? And I mentioned Democrats, just to make sure your viewers know, is that because there are no Republicans in City Hall here. It's a Democratic Party dominated city. The mayor is a Democrat. And as I said, every other council member other than me is a Democrat. So why are the Democrats opposing this? Many of the Democrats, especially in Congress, are overtly corporate politicians. They're literally in the pockets of corporate landlords and fossil fuel industry. This is true in the Washington state legislature itself as well. In Seattle, it's a different thing right now. Since we came into office, there's been an exodus of pro-corporate council members. And what you have more is now what I would call progressive Democrats, who are not the same as corporate politicians, but at the same time, they ultimately serve the interests of big business because they are unwilling to go up against big business. That's the problem.
Let's talk about who's supporting them, because we actually have some wonderful, relevant new polling on this. There was a poll last month from Data for Progress and the Lab, which is a project of the Appeal, and that found that 68% of voters, and that's 75% of Democrats, 71% of independents, and 58%, nearly 60% of Republicans, support a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. So that means this proposal is popular. It's got bipartisan support. Do the vocal opponents of this legislation just not care? Do they think they can message around this with technicalities? What's going on with that?
I think that's exactly right, Emily. I mean, they cannot overtly say, corporate landlords and the politicians who represent them don't come out and say, well, we're against right to counsel because that will eat into the profits that corporate landlords make, or that it will change the balance of power in favor of renters. What they will make technocratic arguments, and I would call them specious arguments, in the sense that on the surface, they sound plausible. They sound, oh, wait a second, maybe they are right. But when you dig in a little deeper, you find out that there is no basis for it. And as you said correctly, the support for this is so tremendous. They are being forced to resort to technocratic arguments, which are actually arguments that have no basis in reality. And look at the powerful statistics also. And this is something that you mentioned earlier, which is when you keep people housed, when we are able to prevent evictions, it actually results in a tremendous saving of public resources because, and in fact, this is a study that showed in Seattle, 90% of people who get evicted actually end up becoming homeless. And a study in Baltimore, which has a strong right to counsel without means testing, they found that for every dollar invested in a right to a lawyer for tenants facing eviction, it would save the city and the state $6.24, meaning orders of magnitude of dollars are saved.
Well, let's talk about some of those examples of where this has been done, because other cities that have implemented a right to counsel have obviously seen huge drops in evictions rates. I'm thinking of Cleveland, where 93% of evictions were prevented during the first 6 months of this right to counsel program. And similar results have happened in New York, where I used to practice, in San Francisco as well. That program's also been highly effective. You talked about where we stand right now, which is over 95% of, I believe it was over 90% of people being rendered homeless by the current structure. If you had a structure in which over 95% of people were actually not getting evicted, and those savings were shown in the city of Seattle, like, what would that mean for your city, for your constituents? What is the world you're trying to build from this?
Oh, Emily, that is such a crucial question. In fact, that is the question that is blanketing Seattle's political consciousness, in the sense that the homelessness crisis and the affordable housing crisis has escalated to such a degree that it is the paramount social and economic question in our city. And we know that Seattle is not the only metropolitan area which is facing this most urgent question. And so this crisis of homelessness is so huge that if we were able to keep people housed simply by the dint of having an attorney by their side, it would have tremendous, unprecedented consequences, positive consequences in preventing homelessness in the first place. Because once homelessness happens, not to mention it is a trauma on the human beings that face it, and it is just an untold trauma. But on top of that, the public resources that get expended in dealing with this problem, that itself in the first place could be avoided. And the evidence from the other cities, as you said, really shows that it's important that we do this. And as you said, we are facing the potential of a tsunami of evictions in the coming months. So this is urgent.
Glad you brought up the timing question. Obviously, it's something I'm so glad we had a chance to talk about today. Councilmember Sawant, I'm so happy to have had you here, and I really hope we'll be able to follow up with you as this issue unfolds and your legislation progresses. I'd love to hear how it turns out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I am so struck by the circumstances that Councilmember Sawant described just now, describing what it is to be living in Seattle right now, COVID impacted, lost your job, stimulus payments may not be enough to make rent in a very expensive city. And this is a city facing, as she said, a tsunami of evictions. And that's a tsunami of actual live people with kids facing being thrown out of their homes and put on the street. And through a process where you have to go into a courtroom, one of the scariest places you can possibly be, hearing language that makes no sense. By the way, I say this as a lawyer, the magic words of a courtroom never make any sense. And to do all that without a lawyer by your side, to lose everything without any right to counsel. It's a shocking and really dangerous situation that people in Seattle are facing right now, as people across the country are. But in Seattle, Councilmember Sawant has brought this legislation, which in other cities like New York, San Francisco, and Cleveland has shown to prevent eviction, preventing over 90% of evictions in cities where right to counsel programs exist. And also, as Councilmember Sawant pointed out, it's not just the evictions that get prevented, it's the eviction filings. Because landlords who know they're going to have to put their lawyer up against another lawyer instead of just going after a regular person are less likely to spend the money doing that in the first place. It's very, very interesting to think about this proposal, especially as it has that rare characteristic of being broadly popular across groups, as we heard from the Data for Progress and the Lab poll. This is something that has garnered Democrat, Independent, and even Republican support. It does seem like something that makes sense for everyone in the whole community, except for maybe corporate landlords. But if every dollar invested in the right to counsel does in fact save $6, as Councilmember Sawant told us, it certainly seems like a good investment for the city of Seattle and for other cities across the country to consider. So thanks for joining us to talk about it. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This has been another episode of The Appeal Live. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook. I look forward to seeing you again soon.